We're going to dig down now into some of the numbers, what it means for people's pockets, for taxes, for spending. Let's speak to Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, an independent economics research institute. Thank you for coming on the programme.
Hi.
So just talk us through what you make, first of all, of the broad brush approach of that speech there from the Prime Minister.
Well, I mean, the Prime Minister is setting out something that we've known for a long time, which is that the public finances are really struggling, public services are really struggling, and if spending cuts are to be avoided, there will be some significant tax rises in the forthcoming budget, which is something that was entirely plain before the election, but of course neither party was willing to say that before the election. The Prime Minister is now saying that that's the case, and I'd absolutely agree with him. I think that is the case. The Chancellor will have a choice between some pretty chunky tax rises or promising some fairly significant spending cuts over the next few years.
Is he right when he's saying that this was all a bit of a surprise, that the fact that when you're not in power, you don't have access to the details of the numbers, and so by saying it's worse than we thought, he's actually justified?
Not really, no, not in terms of the big picture. Yes, there are some small surprises in the public finance numbers this year, but the big picture over the next few years was always completely clear, which was that and this is something the Office of Budget Responsibility pointed out back in March. It's something that we pointed out time and time again during the election campaign, which is that the plans the government inherited imply cuts to public spending over the next few years, and to avoid those cuts whilst keeping to their own very clearly stated fiscal targets in terms of borrowing, then there would need to be some tax rises. Now, the numbers may be a little bit worse than they thought at the time, and I think there were some things that were hidden from view, but the overall picture over the next 4 or 5 years is very, very similar to what we knew before the election.
OK, and what are some of the options here then? Because we know those main taxes on working people, national insurance, income tax, are not going to be changed at all. So what's left?
Well, I think that's one of the deep problems that this government has created for itself to some extent by ruling out those changes. Remember, I think somewhat cynically, the last government cut national insurance contributions by some £20 billion in its last few months in government, but the Labour Party in opposition agreed to them, voted for them, and said they would keep them. And they've said that they won't increase, as you say, rates of income tax, national insurance, VAT, or indeed corporation tax, which between them account for more than 3/4 of all of the tax revenues. I think that leaves them with some very difficult and complex choices. There are some things they might want to do to the taxation of pensions. Some of those I think will be really quite damaging. There are some smaller things they could do there to make things a bit better. There are some quite complicated things they could do to capital gains tax, which I think is required, but that's not just about increasing the rates. I think that requires a big reform to the whole capital gains tax system. There are various strange loopholes that they could close in some parts of inheritance tax and stamp duty and so on, but they don't raise very large amounts of money. I think what is worth saying is if you look across the Western world, there are lots of countries that have much more tax revenue than we do and spend more on public services. But every single one of them, and I mean every single one of them, raises more tax on people on average sorts of earnings than we do. And whilst we do have taxes at high levels by historic standards here, it is the case that direct taxes on people on average earnings are the lowest they've been for 50 years. And trying to significantly increase taxes without impacting that group of people will be very complex and potentially have some negative economic consequences.
Indeed. Paul Johnson, thank you very much for talking us through that. The budget, that big statement of decision coming up in October.